Bom dia, pessoal. Acho que a gente já pode começar aqui o nosso workshop. Esse é o segundo workshop que a gente está fazendo relativo às ferramentas de certificação. Então, na semana passada, a gente teve um workshop que demonstrou o motor funcional. Esse foi apresentado pela Radium. E hoje a gente vai ter esse workshop com a OpenID Foundation, que vai focar no motor de certificação de segurança. Para esse workshop, a gente também vai ter uma tradução em simultânea. Então, a gente mandou algumas instruções para vocês por e-mail e também na atualização desse convite, em como configurar as duas salas para permitir a tradução em simultânea. Mas a gente vai redemonstrar aqui para todo mundo como fazer esse processo para garantir que todo mundo consiga ter o melhor entendimento possível da reunião. Isabela? A Isabela vai ajudar a gente nesse processo.
Bom dia, pessoal. Então, eu estou reenviando aqui no chat para todo mundo o link do Zoom ou o número de telefone para acessar. E aí, lembrando a todos que a gente tem que permanecer, quem precisar da tradução simultânea tem que permanecer nas duas reuniões, tanto essa do Teams quanto a do Zoom. Então, como o Eric comentou, a gente está fazendo essa versão teste de colocar a tradução do workshop também em português. Com essas informações aqui, eu vou passar rapidamente em como que a gente faz para acessar. Basicamente, nós temos três opções, né? Quando usando o mesmo dispositivo, então o computador para acessar as duas reuniões, pelo aplicativo do Teams e pelo Zoom, pelo navegador no Teams e pelo Zoom, e por dois dispositivos diferentes. Então, se vocês estiverem vendo minha tela, nas duas reuniões, né, com o Teams pelo aplicativo e o Zoom também no computador. Então, vocês vão precisar desativar o áudio original do Teams para ouvir somente pelo Zoom, mas continuar vendo a tela e fazendo perguntas referentes ao conteúdo do workshop pelo Teams, tá? Para fazer isso, então, vocês, pelo aplicativo do Teams, clicam nesses três botões no canto superior direito, na opção configurações de dispositivo e desativam o áudio. Então, vocês estão desativando o áudio somente dessa aba do Teams e permanecendo com o áudio do Zoom. E no Zoom vocês entram normalmente pelo link ou pelo número de telefone. Para quem estiver usando o Teams no navegador, é um pouquinho mais simples. Vocês, na aba do Teams do navegador, clicam com o botão direito e desativam o som do site. E aí, com isso, vocês conseguem acessar o áudio do Zoom normalmente. E, por último, quem está usando dispositivos diferentes, é importante aqui só garantir que o dispositivo com a maior tela, então o computador ou o tablet, esteja no Teams, que é onde vai ter um compartilhamento de tela, e o áudio esteja ligado no Zoom, que é onde vocês vão ouvir, tá bom? E aí, reforçando, para fazer perguntas referente ao conteúdo do workshop, vocês fazem isso pelo microfone do Teams.
Perfeito. Muito obrigado, Isa, pela demonstração. Estou vendo aqui que tem várias pessoas entrando já no Zoom. Então, a gente consegue iniciar agora com a OpenID Foundation. So, Mike, will you present for us? First we'd like to thank you for joining us on this workshop. We started the meeting discussing with everyone how to set up the real-time translation. So we will have this feature on this workshop. And I believe you guys can start the presentation.
Hey everyone, yep, let me just share my presentation. So I'm Joseph Heenan. I think most of you know me by now. I'm the certification technical lead of the OpenID Foundation. So today we're just going to cover three things. I'm just going to go through a quick update on where we are with the Brazil profile of the FAPI conformance tests. I'm going to run through a quick demo of the Brazil Pacific tests, and then we've got quite a bit of time set aside for Q&A. So I'm hoping or expecting that there's quite a lot of questions from people. So in terms of where we are on the timeline, again, I think most of you know this, but
Eu acho que a maioria de vocês sabem disso.
Osman, seu microfone está ligado. Obrigado. I'm sorry, Mr. Hina. Please go on.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. So on the 11th of June, we put the beta version of the Brazil FAPI tests for banks into production. So they've been available for people to test for 11 days now, I think. So they're just based on the existing FAPI 1 advanced final tests that the certificate that the OpenID Foundation has.
I think someone put everybody on mute, including the presenter.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. I hadn't spotted that. I'm not sure where I got to. So 11th of June, we launched the beta versions of the bank tests. They're based on the existing FAPI advanced final test that the Foundation has as part of its existing certification tests. And we now want to, in a bug fixing and adding additional tests phase. On the 14th, we put the dynamic client registration test for Brazil into beta. Then the 22nd today, we're launching the beta version of the Brazil relying party tests. That's the tests for the fintechs. They should go into production later today, hopefully. And then on the 28th, the expectation is that the bank tests will leave beta. And then on the 28th, we're expecting, we're opening up the certification program as well. And then we're expecting the phase 2 banks to submit their certifications between the 28th and the 5th of July. And all certifications that get submitted by the 5th of July, the OpenID Foundation will have processed and published onto the website by the 15th of July for the go live. So next stage, I'm just going to run some quick demos of these tests. So this is just using the example configurations that I believe the people at Miro should have shared out. So I'm just going to run through quickly the bank tests and the DCR bank tests. And just know that I know some people have tried running these configurations and have been unsuccessful. That's just, there have been a few changes, but we're making sure these wiki pages are being kept up to date with working configuration. So if you do see a problem, just check the wiki page in an hour or two and hopefully we'll have updated and solved it. But if not, just get in touch and we'll help figure out why you can't run the tests. So let me just switch to my browser. So this is what you see after you've logged into the certification suite. What's my page with the example configuration? Just grab that as well. And this is the wiki page with the instructions for running the suite. So I'm just going to run through this. So I'll just grab the configuration JSON, go to create a new test plan. And then it's just a case of selecting the things that this section of the text of the wiki page tells me to. So I'm just FAPI1 advanced final authorization server test, private key jot, request object by value, select the Brazil profile, and just a plain response. Switch to the JSON tab, paste in the configuration, and you can switch back to the form tab just to see what's been. And sorry, I just realized I'm looking at the wrong wiki page. What the other one? I was looking at the DCR configuration whilst trying to run the non-DCR test. Just grab that configuration, paste it in. That's not the right one either. Excuse me. All right, there we go. So that's the right configuration. So we walked through this form in the last workshop. So I don't think there's anything particularly to comment on, apart from perhaps there's some new Brazil values that only went live on the 11th. So just the resource URL to use, which is the accounts endpoint, which the help tells you to use that, and just the URL for the consent endpoint as well, and the CPF value to be used when creating the consent. We're going to have a change that should hopefully go into production later today that also offers the option of the other kind of identifier. Is it CNPF, possibly, if I got that right? Just that you have the option to use that if your bank only supports business accounts. I believe you'd use that value instead of the CPF. So just create the test plan, and then we just start running tests. So the first test is very simple and just does some basic checks of the configuration endpoints. Just continue running tests. And the next one is a lot more involved. We see the proceed to test button comes up. So we just press that. And we just sign into the mock bank. So again, the username and password to use are listed on the wiki page. We just need to extend this section to authorize access to at least one bank account and consent. Hit continue. We get redirected back to the suite. Does some interactions with the bank. After a second or two, we see the proceed with test button appear again. So we just press that again and do exactly the same process. It's just doing two different types of, or two slight variations on the same test and getting two sets of valid access tokens. And then one of the things it does at the end, once it's got both, is check that certificate bound access tokens are working correctly, and using access token from one client with a different client's TLS certificate does correctly get rejected. So as you can see, that test passed, and there's a very detailed log that shows everything that went on. The log has some heading sections that if you keep an eye on, that gives you a good idea of what's happening in each section. And as I say, it's quite long because this particular test has quite a lot of steps. But, so you can see this final step is the step I mentioned of trying the access token with the wrong client certificate and just checking that we do get an error back. You can see the actual HTTP error that we get. And then it's just a case of going back to the test and carrying on with running the tests. So it's a good idea to pay attention to this blue text here. That occasionally contains explicit instructions. For example, this test requires that you reject the authentication or consent. So again, you proceed with consent, but I think I just switch that off and switch that on. It redirects but back, but I have to do that twice for this test as well. And again, you just carry on running the tests like this and following the instructions. So for some of the tests, let's just find an example. It may actually end up displaying an error in the browser. So if we try the test for the redirect URL being registered, then when we press the proceed with test button, we should get an error back. We don't, but if I had got an error back, then I'd just take a screenshot of it, and I'd go back to the test and hit the upload button. Just select my screenshot, upload it, return to the test log. It wasn't the right screenshot uploaded, but never mind. And then just give it a few seconds and the test will move into finished and review state. And then again, you just carry on running the rest of the tests in the plan. And it will move into the review state anyway, into the finished state on this. Just take a few seconds. Yep, there we go. And then for running the DCR test, it's a very similar process. But select the Brazil dynamic client registration test there. Select the right variants and just take the config from the wiki page.
Joseph?
Yep.
Just noticing some questions are coming in from the group, and the speed might be a little fast for people to keep up. You're so fluent with it. Some people won't be following English as quickly as you can tap through the screens. So 2 questions in the chat. One was, are we planning to include the app-to-app demonstration, and a request to repeat the consent step again, and how to choose the mock bank. Not sure if you can see the chat on the side.
That's that window, right?
I can
do them.
I can
hopefully.
That might make it easier. So was, are we going to cover app-to-app demonstration?
Yeah, so I don't have a test environment set up for app-to-app here. I can briefly talk about how you'd run that, which is, the process is exactly the same, except you'd run the test, and we recommend using a tablet-sized device, because if you run on an actual phone device, you struggle to actually use the Conformance Suite UI just because of limited screen space. So you just access the Conformance Suite website on a tablet. When you press the proceed to test button, if the app is correctly installed and set up, then that button will switch to the app. And then at the end of the process, that will switch back to the certification suite. So obviously that's technically testing web to app rather than app to app. But we've not found any cases yet where that where web to app works, but app to app fails. So it seems to be a valid way of testing it.
Great. And then the second question was, if it's not too much trouble, is it possible to repeat the consent step again? I think that was a little bit.
Absolutely. So I've just started up the DCR test, so as part of that, I need to run the consent test as well. So I've just got to this proceed with test button. So there's no need to actually select the mock bank. I'll explain that after I've actually done this bit. So press the proceed to test. So you just need to expand this bank account information screen and then enable sharing for at least one of the bank accounts. Just click to consent to sharing the above data and then press continue. What's that doing? Okay, I pressed that wrong. It's really one of these days, something quite right there.
Well, it's loading. If you didn't say it earlier, Joseph, just a reminder to everyone, and we've got a big group, please feel free to raise any questions. No question's a bad question. And the meeting chat's a good way to share that, those questions. If you want to write it in Portuguese, we'll have someone help translate for us.
Yeah, so if stuff like that seems to go randomly wrong, then what you do is just go back to the tab that has the test running in it, and just hit the repeat test button, and you can just try it again, and with any luck it will work the second time.
We had another question along the way to please repeat the step that did the screenshot upload. I know that didn't actually load fast enough, but again, again.
There we go. So that's the DCR test passed. So obviously the DCR test plan only has this one test in it at the moment, which just tests the happy flow. We'll add at least one negative test just to check that DCR without a software statement assertion fails. And we'll also add something that just does a quick test that the client management endpoint seems to be working as well. Sorry, what was the step you just asked me to repeat, Gail? I've lost.
Sure. Yes, we had a request to repeat the step that did the screenshot upload, and then I've got a couple other questions after that.
Cool. So let me just go back to that previous test I was running. So just go to view all test plans, and then I'll go back into the plan I was running before, and then I'll just run that same registered redirect URI screen again. And just proceed with test. Again, I'm not getting an error message for some reason, but I'll just take a screenshot of this. So I'm on a Mac, so it's just Command Shift 4 space, and take the screenshot, then go back to the test log. You can either hit the upload images button here, or if you scroll to the bottom of the test, then there's a attach image to log file button here as well. So press that. Yep.
The question regarding the upload screenshot is about what exactly are we testing here? Is it that the tool checks if the screen I got is the same that the tool has when it calls the redirect URL? Is that
okay? Got it.
The screens match.
Yeah. So what should have happened in this case is that the authorization server showed an error saying the redirect URL that the request object used isn't actually registered, so it can't proceed and it can't redirect back to the test suite. So what happens then is you upload a screenshot of that error, and then that becomes part of your certification submission, showing that you were actually showing an error as a result of this test. And then when you submit your results to the OpenID Foundation, one of the things that we go through on our checklist is just making sure the screenshots do seem to match up with what was meant to happen. So it only gets checked manually right at the point of you submitting your certification.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, just uploaded that and returned to the test log. We'll move through. So that was that. There was a question at some point about how to select the mock bank. So you select the bank you're testing against as part of the configuration. So I'll just hit the edit configuration button so I can go back and show you that. So that the mock bank was selected as a result of that configuration JSON I passed in. So to test your own bank, you change this discovery URL that all the endpoints are found from to the discovery URL for your bank. And then you put the client ID and the keys that are the ones that are actually registered and work with your bank.
Mm-hmm.
And you do that twice.
And maybe I can ask the stupid question. So the discovery URL, is that been named for all the participating phase 2 banks? Do they know what their discovery URLs are?
I would hope so. It's the location where they're publishing this OpenID configuration file, which is one of the specs that is a requirement to support for Brazil. So
okay.
It's just a simple file that lists all the endpoints and the keys that will be used and so on. So it hopefully shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that's testing. They've got as far as having something to test against.
Hey Joseph, this is Mike Les. Maybe if we can pause just for a second, a couple things. Ralph Bragg raised his hand, so let's see if Ralph has a question, comment. Ralph?
Hi, thanks Joseph. There was a question earlier, somebody was asking, how can I test different, using the mock bank, different combinations of clients, and it might be worthwhile explaining how you can DCR tests to register your client and then use that client configuration inside the subsequent tests.
Yeah, although that might be a little bit too complicated for me to demo on the fly. But yeah, certainly in the DCR test, you can just change the values here, and the DCR configuration, the test will then register for the different type of client authentication, and it will run through. And as Ralph says, you could then take the resulting client ID if you find it in the test log, which I can just show you where to find it. That's the wrong test. Let me go back to my DCR test. So yeah, if you look at the test log for the DCR test, then if you scroll down, you'll see the first step, it's getting an access token and retrieving a software statement. Then we do the dynamic client registration, and at the end of that you'll see a past registration endpoint response, part of which will be the client ID. And if you take that client ID and paste it into the configuration form for the non-DCR tests, then that client will have been registered to use MTLS, and you can then run the tests against the mock bank using MTLS. We can probably actually just publish an example configuration using MTLS that works, if that would be helpful for people.
I'll add a couple questions here. And Ralph, I think the last question I did you were referring to might be this one, so forgive me if I'm wrong, but there was a question earlier, would it be possible to have a working example from Radium's mock for client auth type, MTLS, FAPI auth request, method by value? I think you covered that, right, Ralph, in your comments?
Yeah, we can you can either register one yourself, which is what Joseph has just shown you, or we can just publish a by reference plain response mode MTLS, which is essentially the opposite.
Super, thank you. And I saw a question about, is it possible to test with my bank screens instead of the mock bank? Joseph?
Yeah, so that is the case where, as I was showing, you just edit the configuration and make sure that you've put the discovery URL for your own bank, the necessary client credentials, and just make sure you update the resource URL, the consent URL, the CPF value, so that they match for what's valid for your own bank.
And then I see a question in Portuguese, Danilo, that came in at 7:26 a.m. in the chat. Not sure if you caught that one. You'd like to speak to it for us all?
Actually, I think Danilo is answering a previous question. It's not exactly a question to the researcher.
Okay. All right. I think that takes us through the open questions right now then.
Okay, I have a couple of questions, if I may. First one is, we've run some tests using the tool for a couple of days now, and there's a problem that we found with the client certificates in the DCR and the FAPI flows that are evaluating the distinguished name in an incorrect way based on the ICP Brazil requirements. And it's a simple matter of just regenerating the certificates in order to comply with the tests. But in fact, I think the tests should comply with the right Brazilian certificate profile. So where should I raise this issue? Should I open a ticket in the GitLab, or should I send it through email?
Yeah, if you can open a ticket in the GitLab, that's best.
Okay.
So I did have a final slide that happens to answer that question. So
it's just a minor issue, though. Is that the tests are using the common name, and they're expecting the common name to be the software ID, and in fact, the common name for the Brazilian client certificate is FKDN, and the software ID should be taken from the I believe the serial number. I'll just check. Okay.
No.
Oh.
Alex,
Hey,
sorry. So I've raised this with the security team before, and I've raised this with Marcos.
Really?
The specification that the security team and Joseph is applying is correct. The specification for TLS client auth is an explicit DN match, which means the common name, which is part of the distinguished name in the ICP, must match. So this isn't an issue with either the specifications or the certification test suite. It's an issue with the ICP specification for the Brazil transport certificate. Now, the Radium mock bank deliberately recognizes this problem and is deliberately not spec 100% compliant.
Yeah.
Because if you use certificates as you've designed, if you change the common name at all, it changes the DN. And if you change the DN, it isn't an exact match. So the mock bank handles it fine, but the expected names for the conformance and certification suite are 100% as per the IETF specification for MTLS. So
Sure.
I've raised this previously, and I've said you have to address this with guidance, but this is one that needs to come through the security working group of Brazil first before it comes out, because you could change the specs, but as they're written at the moment, it must be an explicit DN match, distinguished name, full string, of which you have a common name which you can change whenever you like. And because it's part of the DN, it means you're changing the credential ID.
No, I'm good with that, and I think you're right. We should take this back to the table. But for instance, if I managed to create a new certificate using the CN as the software ID in order to pass the tests, but when I'm going through the certification steps and I use that ICP Brazil certificate, it's going to fail. So I'm not sure exactly how could we handle this.
So if you're going to go through, it shouldn't fail if you're using the FAPI Conformance Suite. If it does fail, it's not a FAPI Conformance Suite issue. It's a mock bank issue. So it means that you need to put a ticket into us as a mock bank issue. But what I would suggest we do is that we update the example configuration so that it's using the ICP style certificates and not the legacy OB UK style certificates. And that way, it'll be testing with something that's ICP-like, and so you'll find these issues using the ICP certs. That's easy for us to do. We'll do that this afternoon.
Yeah. Okay. Because that's exactly it. The suite is getting the CN and thinking and accepting it as the software ID, and for the ICP standard, it's not. I'm not sure if I make myself clear. And with that, the test fails. I might be able to. Oh, okay. I'm gonna do this by a ticket, so we can get an official position.
That'd be great. Thank you.
There have been several questions running in the log. I don't think we've covered, so forgive me if we have. There was one question for the DCR registered clients. Where is the JWOX key server running for those clients? I think JWOX is JWKS.
Yeah, that's right. So the assumption is that the JWKS is hosted on the directory, and the suite will register using the JWKS URI that's contained within the software statement that is retrieved from the directory.
Okay, there's another question. This has probably already been discussed, but in Sandbox, are the TPP certs expected to be self-signed? How does OCSP work in that case?
Sounds like a question for Ralph, perhaps, if you're there, Ralph.
Yeah, so in Sandbox, there is a fully fledged EKI that is a development version of the ICP, of an ICP PKI. It fully supports CRL and OCSP. So everything that you would need in a real production environment is fully supported by the directory and the trust framework in Sandbox.
Thanks, Ralph. I see Mike Less has popped the link for GitHub in the chat. Some people want to copy it from there. The other links that you have here in this in the page, Joseph, is this part of a document that the group has already, or if they want to pull the links from there, or should they screenshot this page on their laptops right now?
Gail, this is Mike Les. I'm going to put all the links in the chat, but we'll also be sharing this deck with the Miro team so that they can publish this for the entire ecosystem to have access to after the workshop.
Great. Mike. And then another question, can you guys point docs examples of how a client should implement a FAPI-based OAuth?
So a reference, an example client for FAPI has been published on the security is on the security website. It's on the security Git. So there's an example relying party.
Sorry, I didn't.
FAPI client that you can use to test.
Okay, thanks. And next question, can you explain each configuration item that is passing the test?
I presume that's basically asking what each value in the configuration is for. Let me just switch back to my browser.
Yeah, I think there was a question. Could you explain each configuration item that is passing the test? So I guess that's a little bit of a overview.
So for this, each test item has help. If you just hover over this little I, and there is also a link here. If you look at the OpenID certification instructions and the how to run conformance tests for FAPI read-write OPs. If we just open that, then this test runs you rather more verbosely through exactly what you need to do and what to fill in where it needs a little bit more explanation that we can include in the pop-up tooltip. I can quickly run through them. I think we've got time. The alias is just forms part of the redirect URLs. It's just because obviously our production server is a shared server that there could be multiple people using. This is just something that goes into the redirect URLs that's unique to you so that your tests don't interfere with anyone else's and vice versa. The description field is just a free-form field that is really for your own notes of exactly what you are testing. The publish field is you can just leave that set to no. If you want to share your results publicly, you can always publish them later. But by default, when you're running tests, as long as you keep this set to no, your results are only visible to you. So it's on if you wanted to make it visible to someone else that you would publish them. The discovery URL we mentioned earlier is just the location for the OpenID configuration file on your bank. Then we have the client authentication, so the client ID that has been registered at your bank. The scopes to use, which I think will always be OpenID accounts for Brazil and for these tests. The JWKS for the client, which is the client's private key, just in the JSON web key format, or the JSON web key set format in particular, because it has the keys array. And then the MTLS client certificate and private key and certificate authority, which I believe there are instructions for the sandbox directory that show you how to generate these and get the directory to sign them and then presumably register them with your bank server. And then there is a second client.
Joseph, maybe a good time for a health check about the use of the private key, being super careful around where they place that private key.
Yeah, so obviously this is a private key that does give access to your bank system. So particularly when you're testing a production system, do take care with what you do with this configuration. Do make sure that you don't publish anything that has your private keys in them until you've deactivated them at the point you're ready to submit your certification. And yeah, it is a private key, so do take care with it. We have seen, at least in the UK, some people publishing private keys places they shouldn't. So yeah, configuration for a second client. And again, you need to register 2 clients for the test to be able to do check security properties, like that a refresh token issued to one client is not usable by another valid client. So you just need 2 distinct clients, which means they also need different software IDs as well in some or most cases. That might vary depending on which type of client authentication you're using, possibly. Then the final values are just the resource URL, which will always be the accounts resource. So it'll be in this v1/accounts format for wherever your API endpoints are. The consent endpoint that the suite will use just to create the consent before it sends the user to the authorization endpoint, and then just the CPF value, which is some kind of national ID that I'm assuming you guys understand much better than I do. And that's all the configuration values for that test. If we just quickly look at a DCR test instead, just the one I was running earlier.
When you've run through that, we have 3 questions pending, and I have one too.
Great. So the DCR configuration is very similar. You only need one client in this case. Everything's the same, but the only bit is different is at the end you need to provide some information about the directory. So the OpenID configuration file for the directory. So obviously at this stage everybody will presumably be using the sandbox directory, but at some point you'll need to switch to using the real directory for testing instead. So the final certification I would expect will be run on the production directory against a production bank server. The client ID on the directory that corresponds with the certificates you supplied, and just the API base URL for the directory, which again, that's the sandbox one currently, but in due course, I'm sure people will switch to production. And that is all the configuration fields.
Sorry, Joseph, can you just clarify, are we expected to run the final tests in production?
Not my understanding.
So that was my understanding. Certainly that's what happens in the UK and in Australia. I wasn't aware that anything different had been agreed in Brazil. Do you know anything about that, Ralph?
No, that's a policy question to Miro and the sandbox and certification testing squad.
Okay, thanks, Ralph. Yeah, I mean, the usual expectation would be that these tests are run against production, because what we've seen in other ecosystems is that the tests are, or the configurations of the servers is very sensitive, and most banks are not generally able to guarantee that they have a working FAPI configuration in production without testing the production server.
Does Miro have anything to add with this?
Yes, sure. It's Paulo here. Good morning. The policy we adopt here is that the test can be done on a pre-production environment or in production. It's a choice of the institution. The problem of doing on production is that you have to be very careful with your certificates. You are exposing your certificates, so you have to revocate after the test, and the data, the user you are using for the test have their data exposed to, and for the DCR test and FAP there isn't much data exposed, but for the functional tests you have to have clients with accounts and other products. So it's very hard to test here in Brazil, since you can't have a test clients on production. You have to use real clients. So we believe most institutions will do the test on a pre-production environment.
Thank you, Paula. That's helpful.
So let me run through a couple of the new questions, Joseph. This one's a little long. In the context of FAPI 1.0 Advanced, allowed client authentication methods are private key JWT or JOT, TLS client auth, and self-signed TLS client auth. The blog below explains details of the client authentication methods and includes links to the relevant specifications. And then I think that's more informative. So OAuth to client authentication. So I don't think there's a question. I think it's just clarification. Next one is.
This is Taka, and who wrote the comment on the chat. It is not a question, that the information for
Thank you.
The audience.
Thank you. I started reading it before I read the whole thing. Thank you.
No problem.
We have another question. Could you confirm this understanding on the flow that we are simulating the test scenario where we are on the TPP going to catch data on the ASPSP? ASPSP. Is that right? The data were imputed like authorization server URI. Are your data by ASPSP? Thank you.
Yes, so that's correct. We're testing a bank here, and the conformance suite is pretending to be a TPP, and it's just running through and checking that the bank does provide things to the TPP in the way expected when the TPP makes the right requests. There is a set of tests for the other way around, the relying party test. So that's where the conformance suite pretends to be a bank and then expects the TPP to treat the conformance suite as a bank, and it runs through some test scenarios. It's the happy path flow, and then checking that if the bank server returns, say, an invalid signature to the client, then that the client detects that and aborts the transaction. So those are a separate set of tests, which we're publishing the Brazil versions of today. And I think we're probably perhaps going to look at running a different workshop to go into a bit more detail on those tests.
Great. I see there's a related question, I think, to this production environment. So some financial institutions during phase 2 might not have current account information to be published. If that is the case, my understanding is that there is nothing expected to be published in any of the accounts endpoint. Therefore, does it still make sense to request for OpenID and accounts as the minimum scope?
Okay, that is information that I was previously unaware of. So thanks for that, Alex. So obviously we need to make some change to the conformance suite to cater for that, I expect. I don't know if there's only one alternative or if there's multiple alternatives. If you could perhaps open an issue on the GitLab, on the link we shared before, just with any details you can share, then that would be helpful, and we'll make sure the suite gets updated to cater for that case.
Thank you, Alex.
Joseph, the value of the resource URL in the test configuration is account, v1 account, and probably the specification of the API is written at the URL I pasted to the chat. And according to the specification, the document says this operation does not require authentication. And I'm not sure what this means, but it can be interpreted like the endpoint does not have to be protected by an access token. And so, but please double check what resource URL of the configuration expects the endpoint, how the endpoint behaves.
Thank you, Taka. I'll double check that specification.
Joseph, just a point. It looks like every bank has to implement the resources API. So if there's concerns over some banks not having to implement the accounts API, we could change this to accessing the resources API. There is a mock resources API, and the consent process is already available for resources. So again, this is more of a question to Brazil, is that if the resources API is the universal customer protected API, please let, I suppose, Alex or the functional team know, and perhaps the resources API instead of the accounts API would be a better candidate for the test.
Hi, Ralph, thank you. I pasted a link to the specification of the resources API, and the document says that the endpoint requires two scopes. One is the resources scope, and the other is consent.consent ID scope. So
that's correct.
Probably, I guess if we replace the accounts to resources, the certification test will not pass.
No, the certification test will pass because you change the scope as well from accounts to resources, and you change the permission from accounts read to resources read. The point is providing a test that every bank has to implement. And if every bank has to implement the resources API for phase 2, but only some of the resources need to implement accounts, then it would make sense to use resources. In addition, Bruno has raised a point that says, actually, maybe it should be the customer identification for a natural person API that should be the universal API. Either way, it would be useful if Brazil could feed back to the foundation which API should be the universal API that all banks have to implement for phase 2, because making the changes is straightforward. The mock bank supports them all, so
it is the resources API.
Thanks, Sam. So that's an easy one. We can change that to the resources API, and then everyone can use that configuration to test.
Okay, then, but the certification test will have to call the end of the resources API with an access token which has resources scope and the consent ID scope. Correct. And if the certification program is not programmed in that way, the certification program needs to be modified, right?
So the certification process already uses consent ID. It's already using the dynamic consent ID. The only thing that changes is a few strings. We're changing the scope, changing the permission code. This is not, I can raise the pull request myself, Taka. This is a very simple change.
Okay, thank you. So I just worried about if the certification test does not send an access token that satisfies the requirements.
So for absolute clarity on this point, it sounds like we may want to circulate an update afterwards once Miro or what it's called, the security working group has validated that it's the API resources that everyone is implementing. Joseph, is that what we need to see here, is just to have that confirmed is the case?
Yeah, that would be helpful. Yeah, it seems it's Bruno arguing with himself now or someone else. I've lost track. But yeah, if somebody could just tell us what we need to do, that's fine. If it means we potentially need to support two different endpoints because there isn't actually a fully universal one, then that shouldn't be an issue. But we just need someone to tell us exactly what the need is.
All right, great. Let's see if we can close that one down today and circulate to this group so there's no question. As a higher level question myself, Joseph, just to kind of raise this up for a moment, what would we expect of all of the phase 2, the first 24 banks that are implementing? Where would we expect them to be in their process? Like, should they all be in the test environment, actively testing? Like, is that what good looks like right now?
Yeah, I would hope so. So I would imagine most of the banks already have systems live that, at least in theory, are FAPI compliant, given I think there's now, where are we, just, is it, I think it's exactly 2 weeks or just around 2 weeks that the certifications need to be submitted to meet the regulatory deadline, I believe. So yeah, I would expect people have systems live, and then they're running the tests either using our production system in the cloud, or I know some of the banks have been deploying locally and presumably running against a pre-production environment of some kind. So hopefully people are getting through that. If you are running it into issues that the tests aren't actually working for you, please do either drop an email to the certification team or open an issue, whichever you feel is probably most correct. But yeah, the team are here, and if we have bugs, we're ready to fix them and hopefully get the fixes rolled out pretty quickly.
We are expecting kind of a couple bugs, right? Because the profile for Brazil is a little bit different, right? So it's fair. Was my point. It's fair play to raise questions and to also, point out if there's any bugs that have been identified because they're updated tests specific to Brazil.
Yes, definitely. As with any software project, you always expect a couple of gremlins. It's probably helpful if people can veer towards raising items as bugs, as we are still getting up to speed with the Brazil standards, and it's helpful if we can refer other people to the reports to check what the answer is if there's questions about exactly how the Brazil Pacific bits of the standard work.
Great. And I see Ralph on that last open question. There's an ask out to Bruno and Sam to follow up and let us.
Até dia 11/6 eu assinei.
Não, mas acho que eu curti para pagar agora referente ao segundo semestre.
Deixa eu ver.
Great. I think we've gotten through all the questions on the list here. We'll keep an eye on that log of questions. In the meantime, Joseph, was there anything else that we needed to cover with the wider group while we wait to see if more questions come up now?
No, I mean, I think we have covered everything. So I think it's the onus is very much on the banks now to test and report any issues to us and get their systems into full compliance.
Great. And I also understand there's a parallel call going on in Portuguese. If anyone's following that conversation and questions have come up there, we invite you to raise them in this forum. Okay, I see something coming in. Okay, I see Sam Larson raised a ticket. Thank you, Sam. And something here, option B might be personal identifications as a universal. Okay, so that's more of a clarification. Universal API endpoint. So I think folks are still looking at that question, and I haven't seen anything new come in. Joseph, one option we have, if there's not more ground to cover, is that we could keep the line open for a little bit longer and let the wider group jump off if they have what they need. And let any others, if they've got any detailed questions, to hang on there, and feel free to open any other questions that are on their mind.
Sure, sounds good. So yeah, I'm happy to hang around here and answer any more questions as they come up for a little bit. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining and listening and providing thoughtful insight today.
Great. Yeah, just this is Gail Hodges speaking. I'm the executive director of the OpenID Foundation, and Mike Letts, who's the program manager for the OpenID Foundation, and Joseph, you've been listening to, is leading our certification team. So you got all the right people listening in here. We are thankful for all of your efforts to test the test, as it were, and good momentum here in the Brazil market. We're delighted to see your progress, and there's obviously quite a bit more to work through over the next couple of weeks before those submissions are due. Is there anything that the Miro team or the security working group in Brazil would like to raise before we close? I have seen one or two additional questions just pop up in the meantime. Will the conformance suite test be adapted to scopes of the phase 3?
Yep. So I don't know the full context of that question. So I know as part of phase 3, I believe all banks, or at least all banks that are doing payments, are required to support FAPI-CIBA. So we will be publishing Brazil-specific versions of the FAPI-CIBA certification tests in due course, which will be a similar set of changes as we made to the core FAPI tests. I'm not sure if there are any other changes that were necessary. The certification suite basically only needs one resource endpoint, and it assumes that all resource endpoints have the same security restrictions applied to them, and we just use that resource endpoint to ensure that certificate-bound access tokens and the few other properties that are required of a resource endpoint are correctly implemented. So if there is any other requirements for phase 3, please do let us know.
Great, and I know, Danilo Branco, that you had been working on a translation of some of the documents. I'm not sure if that's been posted on the OpenID Foundation website yet, Mike. If there's anything you want to point people to in terms of Brazil language.
Hi, Gail. Thanks for raising that. So the document that Gail is referencing is a FAPI implementers guide that OIDF member Taka Kawasaki with Authlead authored some time ago, and then updated it once the FAPI final specs were approved and put into production. And Danilo has been kind enough to translate that to Portuguese, and he just completed that earlier today. So we will get that published both to the OIDF website, and we'll share with the Miro team so that they can publish that for the entire Brazil ecosystem. So we should have that for you later today or first thing tomorrow at the latest.
Great. Danilo, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah. Just make some adjustments. I'm just make some corrections. I have just now to do this. So Mike, please give me a couple of hours just to read again and see if you have any error, any Portuguese error. I'm correcting now. And I also sent to Siqueira the link of the mutual RFC, because the question that he put and will put the issue is about the RFC of the mutual, besides of the use of the ICP Brazil.
Great, thank you for starting to make those updates already, Danilo. That's perfect, and Mike, obviously, for distributing that to the group to help them with local language. That's obviously fantastic. I have seen one additional question come in, Joseph, which is that just acknowledging that not every institution has personal or I guess individual clients. Some only have business clients, so there may be consequences for them to be able to test.
Yeah, so hopefully we can get the universal endpoint. Yeah, that the fact that some banks only have business clients was one of the reasons we added the extra configuration form entry for the CPNF or whatever the alternative to the CPF is, so that banks that do only have business clients are able to run the tests.
Yeah, but sorry, Joseph, but just one point about this, John. Thinking in the institution that only has the business person, the business client, you should look for every business client that has a person that is responsible for the business. So, and maybe if you will see that what Ralph are talking, that is very important about the universal endpoint, you may see that you have a person that is responsible for this business, and maybe this person can be used to do the test.
Can I just provide a little clarity? There is still confusion, and it's not clear between the consent requirements for the CPF, the CMPJ, and then who and how you do matching for CMPJ for business accounts. There are 2 open tickets on the security GitLab, and I'd welcome any more people to provide their opinions on this, but it is still waiting clarification from the security working group and the consents working group and the user experience working group, just how the CMPJ to CPF mappings and that consent process is supposed to then function, because it's not clear. And unfortunately, because it's not crystal clear, there are still some ambiguities in the profile. But when clarity is made to the CMPJ consent, CPF relationships, etc., and then you can update the profile. So the Brazil security team can update the profile.
If I may add some info to that subject, actually, as Danilo was saying or asking, I'm not sure, but I don't exactly agree with your point of view, Danilo, because I think that my clients are the enterprises, not the persons that represent them. So from our point of view, we don't have any implementations of the natural person or the personal clients. And I take this opportunity also to say that conformance tests should support this kind of scenario. Like my institution won't have any personal clients, so I won't be able to provide any CPFs for the tests. Like it won't make any sense to us. We can provide a test CNPJ, but CPFs won't make any sense to us.
Okay, I got it. I will put, as Ralph said, I will put the scope that I'm thinking to do this in the CMPJ in the GitHub. So I will update there what I'm thinking and maybe see how we can do this. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Ralph Bragg, did you have a question or some comments that you'd like to make?
Ralph?
Yeah, it helps if I come off mute. So I've just put a link to the issue, and there's a few issues on this topic inside the Brazil security specifications. The issue is assigned to the security team, it's assigned to the functional team, and it's assigned to the user experience team, because it has issues that affect all of those different user groups. So exactly what needs to go where for the consent request And then also in the OpenID Connect responses, remembering that OpenID Connect is supposed to define some properties about the user authentication. So even though the resources might be owned by a CMPJ and you have a corporate account that owns the resources, the OpenID security profile describes elements about the user that was performing authentication and authorization. So whilst the resources may be owned by the enterprise, the authentication process was performed by an individual. So that relationship between consent, authentication, the user performing authentication, and what needs to go into what tokens and when isn't clear. And it's recognized that it's not clear, and it's assigned to the security team, the functional team, and the user experience team to work out.
Are there any final questions?
Carlos raised.
Carlos has a question. Go ahead, Carlos.
Carlos? Paulo, você tá aí? O Eric, é só para esclarecer aqui, então, a OIDF vai ficar de fazer um teste que vai ser universal para todos, e a gente só precisa saber quando eles vão disponibilizar isso.
Opa, bom dia. Pelo meu entendimento, sim, tá? Acho que um exemplo que atenda todo mundo ser disponibilizado.
Ok.
São dois pontos aqui. A gente vai fornecer o recurso, o scope e o permission para eles relativo a esse recurso universal, e eles vão implementar na plataforma. E a gente teria essa atualização para todo mundo.
O recurso seria a API de Supply Resources, ou ainda precisamos definir?
Eu entendo que esse ponto tem que ser trazido para fora desse workshop. Acho que precisa de um consenso de alguns grupos ainda. Mas pode ficar tranquila, Mari, que eu acho que é uma discussão que a gente teria no squad também. Vou trocar para o inglês. So, Mike, Gail, Joseph, Ralph, Danilo, everyone. I believe we don't have further questions here, so I believe we can close this meeting. I would like to thank you all for hosting this event here. It's very important for everyone to understand how the engine works and to be able to certify by the due date we have.
Yes, thank you to the Miro team for partnering with the foundation on this latest workshop and coordinating the workshop. And we'll distribute the meeting materials to Miro so that they can share those with the workshop participants. So thank you all again, and we'll be in touch soon.
Perfect. And to everyone, we will share the content of this meeting on our YouTube channel together with all the materials sent by the OpenID Foundation. We will also update our GitHub afterwards. And obrigado a todos pela presença.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Tchau, tchau.